Scalpel, scissors, syringe, magnifying glass, knife. I guess I forgot to clean the knife. I'm going to need my tape recorder for this. Autopsy dated November 22nd, 1991, 7:32 p.m. Led by Dr. Jack Hanman. I begin by verifying the identity. It's most likely Harper Lloyd, age 35. It is also known that the deceased was diagnosed with affective bipolar disorder. Harper was placed. The last person who had contact with the deceased was her partner. Police records also show that Mrs. Lloyd was in constant conflict with her neighbors. The constant parties and firefighters found the body after the Chelsea family began complaining that their tap water tasted strange, and at one point had begun to smell. And the most important task in forensic identification of a drowned person is to distinguish whether the death occurred before or after entering the water. Okay. That could have been worse. I carefully removed the victim's clothes so as not to. The deceased was found. One shoe was missing. I'm going to need the camera to document all possible suspicious marks. Definitely the first thing that stands out is the very advanced post-mortem gigantism. The skin of the deceased appears very delicate, smooth, and relaxed from being in the water for a long time. The whole body is extremely pale. Post-mortem markings are seen on the underside of the body, that is, on the back, thighs, and calves of the deceased. It's likely that the deceased was lying on her back when she was fished out. The skin on the hands can be easily separated from the body. The separation takes the form of a glove. There are some obvious scratches on the skin. There are bruises and hemorrhages on the neck. These usually occur due to increased inhalation when fighting to breathe underwater. The so-called washerwoman's skin on the feet. The deceased had indeed been in the water for a long time. So, after the preliminary exam, it's time to take a closer look at this. Today's date, the deceased was clothed. Rigor mortis does not need to be checked. Based on the state of decay, you can be sure it has subsided. We see thick white foam in the mouth of the deceased, resulting from pulmonary edema. Foam is a characteristic in deaths due to drowning. The spots have a purplish blue-red hue, which is a typical sign of the death of the organism. There are obvious scratches on the skin, especially on the back and hands. These could be defensive wounds, evidence of some sort of altercation prior to death. No obvious signs of struggle. The skin on the hands would have easily peeled away from the flesh. Some of the fingers have already lost their nails. Yep, pretty typical. Livor mortis are formed as a result of putrefaction of blood in the veins. Due to the fact that the deceased was wearing shoes all the time, her feet are in better condition than her hands. Nevertheless, we can still notice a clear, wavy skin and the so-called washerwoman's skin texture. Okay, that's probably enough to indicate a direction for further examination. I'd better note that down in the records. Marks found on the neck and foaming. There doesn't seem to diffuse spot. Hands heavily wrinkled considering the deceased's penchant. Those abrasions appear relatively fresh. No healing or scarring is visible. In this case, they're just liver mortis. Fortunate, a simple trip. Maybe it's just an abrasion. Or maybe the result of. Before I begin the dissection, I'll make sure the suggested identity is correct. The suitcase with the fingerprint equipment should be around here somewhere. Oh, here. The fingerprint sheet should always be checked. Slipping. If the body of the deceased is well preserved, with decomposing bodies, the tissue of the pads and the fingers tends to shrink. To remove these shrinkages, a mixture of glycerin or air is used. I'm going to conduct a dactyloscopic examination. If in fact the deceased is in the police database, I will find her. Glycerin is injected successively between the nail and the skin of each finger. The substance then enters the fingertip, removing shrinkage and wrinkles. Now I take a brush. Only when the skin is taut and elastic can you use ink. I think it's enough. In the case of drowning victims, you have to be extremely careful. The skin may fall off the hand like a glove when you take the print. I'll use the fax machine to add the print into the system. Green button, and... I wasn't sure it would amount to anything, but the World Wide Web has been a blessing for speeding up my work. Once the data uploads, I'll run the prints against... Great, the data is there. Click upload. Now, go through the database and find a matching... One more. Analyze button. And we have a result. Everyone has a story to tell, even if it's just a police record. So, as predicted, the deceased turned out to be Harper Lloyd. That went smoothly. I'll print this out and attach it to the medical records. Great. Now I can go back to my inspection. I'm adding the name of the deceased. I'll start the internal examination by taking fluid from the victim's brain. A needle inserted through the nose will do the trick. If the victim was alive when she fell into the well, she must have swallowed water fighting for her life. And then diatoms, characteristics of pooled water like a well, got into the body. In the meantime, I'll check the sample under the microscope. I'm sure that these algae traces will be found in the samples taken from the well where police found the body. Now I need to adjust the knobs properly. And I won't even notice an army of I'm finally starting to see something here. And it's not a dirty lens, I'm afraid, but rather a bad focus. And perfect. Great. This way I'll see if I'm dealing with a large concentration of these algae. I'm finally starting to see something here. It's not a dirty... And perfect. The aperture's still... I'm finally starting to see something here. I won't even notice an army of diatoms. Great. This way I'll see if I'm dealing with a large concentration of these algae. As expected, we find the aforementioned algae in the solution. Their upper part, Epitheca, which overlaps the lower, hypotheca, is clearly visible. The presence of diatoms in the brain samples taken indicate that the deceased was certainly alive when she fell into the water and was possibly conscious. Since there were diatoms in the brain, it means that many more of them must have entered the body. Studies of the rest of the organs will most likely confirm this hypothesis. I can finally get to the practical part. I must be extra careful because the skin of the deceased is very stretched. I wouldn't want an explosion here. You can immediately see a very large swelling of the organs. In addition, all internal organs are very congested. I proceed to remove the rib cage. It's easy to see that the ribs have been imprinted in the lungs. So, I'm going to start by drawing blood from the lung. If diatoms were only present in the lungs, this would mean that the victim was placed in the well after death, and the perpetrator wanted to get rid of the corpse. Taking the lungs in my hand, I feel that the tissues have lost their elasticity, which is the result of water emphysema. In addition, there is significant swelling of the organs, and as a result, we have a nice imprint of the ribs. The emphysema itself, it's clear how far it's progressed, which is characteristic of drowning. Corpses found in water are worth examining with a tomograph. However, I can't count on such luxuries, so I must reach for a more archaic technology: a bucket and water. Ooh, I hope no one dipped a mop in it. It's best to go to the lab for this. Historically, the lung float test is used to detect infanticide. The water should be at room temperature. That's enough. To test for this, I have to place the lungs in a container of water. This checks if there is air in the lungs. And speaking of lungs, everything is ready.
Oh, Jesus.
Of course, such a study isn't without flaws. Air may have entered a newborn's airways during resuscitation attempts. Gases released during decomposition. In this case, however, it's about something else, namely, the amount of fluid in the lungs. To test for this, I have to place the lungs in a container of water and wait to see if they fall or if they will float on the surface. Just as I assumed, the lungs collapsed easily. Fluid could have entered the lungs during panic attempts to catch breath underwater, but it could also be the result of bacterial infections or cancer, so further investigation is needed. I move on to dissecting the lungs of the deceased. You can hear the distinct, very unpleasant crackling of the tissues being cut through. The parenchyma is remarkably pale, although small hemorrhagic foci and petechia are present on the surface. All right. Now, I will check the collected fluid under a microscope. If we find 20 diatoms on the slide, it can be considered drowning, and our result is not false positive due to possible contamination. The aperture still needs a Oh, I'm finally starting to see something here. I won't even notice an army of diatoms from this distance. Great. And perfect. As expected, in solution, the diatoms are clearly visible. There are smaller and larger clusters of them. There will definitely be more than 20 of them. I'll make a note of all this. So far, this case looks pretty standard. It's clear from the beginning that it's drowning. Well, the procedure requires me to check everything anyway. So I move on to checking the other organs. I ligate the heart and then remove it for inspection. Strongly developed putrefactic hemolysis of the organ can be seen at first glance. Apart from that, no signs of a heart attack or other heart disease. I move on to the next organ. This time, it's the liver. It's immediately apparent that the deceased didn't care for herself. Like most organs, her liver is enlarged and severely congested. The beginnings of cirrhosis are visible in some areas. I transfer the organ to a board and proceed to dissect. The cross-section clearly shows dilated veins and many small hemorrhagic foci. I must admit that this is quite a feat, considering the rather young age of the deceased. Harper enjoyed drinking so much that she might not have lasted a few more years. I move on to the stomach. I take a sample of the fluid for testing. It looks very turbid. I'll see what happens after spinning, but that's in a moment. Now, I carefully ligate the organ, then cut it off. It's enlarged, probably full of putrid gases. I transfer it to the board and carefully open it, checking the contents. One thing you'd never get used to is how much this desk smells. Okay, the stomach is full of fluid and unidentified organic matter, which is probably leftover food. So let's check the diatoms. Again, but in a centrifuge for a change. The problem with examining drowned people is being able to show whether the death was due to drowning or whether something else contributed to the death. Cramp, heart attack, drugs, homicide, or some accident. Such an analysis requires viewing from different angles and a careful interpretation of the collected data, including those from the field. That's why it's so important to collect as many samples as possible. Unfortunately. Okay, this is one last little sample. Now, set. Done. I'll run it directly into the chromatograph and run it against the data from the police. I'm certain the analysis will show similarities between the fluid and water in Chelsea's well. Let me think. 3 milliliters should be fine. Okay, now it's the chromatograph's turn. Well, the results are quite clear. I was hoping it would be a more interesting case. More diatoms. Analysis indicates the same origin. Blah, blah, blah. There's little left to do. I'm going to check the airway patent. Interesting. Looks like there's something stuck in the trachea. I'm moving to the board for further inspection. I dissect the trachea and open the organ. Inside, I found, based on the size, I can say that it's a woman's wedding ring, quite standard from the outside. There's an engraving inside.